I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're really excited about this panel discussion. And today's panel discussion is entitled How Israel Implements the Law of Armed Conflict to Defend Against Terrorists Hiding Among Civilians. I think this is an incredibly important topic. I think it's very relevant. I know we receive from our readers many questions along these lines, so I'm thrilled to be able to provide expert opinion on the matter. I can explain some of these things a little bit better to all of us so that we can better discern what the news is telling us and what the media is telling us about the current situation. So just a couple housekeeping things before we get into the program. First of all, my name is Kimberly Kay. I'm the Director of Operations and Editorial Development with the Legal Insurrection Foundation, and I also serve as a Senior Contributing Editor for the Legal Insurrection blog, where I've been for almost 7 years now. And so as we get started, we are going to take questions from you live once we get through the program. So each of our panelists will have prepared statements that they're going to share. And then I'll be monitoring both the chat section and the question and answer section. So what we ask is that if you want to engage in chat, you can do that using the chat function. We do ask that you keep it on topic and please be civil. Which is not something we've ever had a problem with, but I just feel compelled to bring it up just in case, particularly when we're dealing with what could be a contentious topic. So if you have questions, please put those in the question and answer section. I'll be monitoring those. And so once we get to the end of the panelist presentation, I will go through and pose questions to people. So we will answer those live. We'll get through as many as we possibly can. So just be sure to put that there. This event is being recorded. And I also want to mention that the individuals that are appearing on this panel are not necessarily representing the opinions of their employer. These are just their own thoughts and ideas on the topic that we're discussing today. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce my boss, Professor William Jacobson, who has many, many titles. He's a clinical law professor at Cornell Law School. He's also the president of the Legal Insurrection Foundation and the publisher of the Legal Insurrection blog. And just so you'll know, as we go through, as each speaker is speaking, rather than read a long bio, I'm going to paste that into the chat section so that you can read, and links for things that they have published, I will also place there. And so very quickly, I do want to add that we are a 501c3, and so we are purely donor supported. We run an incredibly lean operation. So every single dollar that we get, we put right back into programming so that we can bring you events like this and other research and other valuable tools for free. So please keep that in mind. And if you enjoy today's program, consider donating, and I'll put that link in the chat as well. So without further ado, Professor Jacobson.
Hi, how are you? Thank you, everybody who showed up. It's not our normal time to do it. We usually do Sunday nights, but given the time change with two of our speakers in Israel, we felt that it was better to do it during the day. This is a topic that is extraordinarily timely, and it's something that if you'd asked us 2 months ago, would we be doing this topic, we probably would have said no. But political and military and world events change, and so it was our idea to do this in light of the flood, the overwhelming flood of misinformation and disinformation that has been taking place since the recent 11-day conflict precipitated by Hamas firing rockets at Israel. It's something of a flashback because our website, I think the first of the major conflicts that we covered was the 2014 Gaza conflict. And this is something like here we go again in terms of media coverage and disinformation. At that time, and again this time, the media battlefield becomes extremely important. Maybe not as important as the actual battlefield, but Israel has always, at least in my coverage, done much better on the actual battlefield than on the media battlefield. And so we're hoping to arm you with facts and information that can help you respond to some of the misinformation and lies that are spread around. There are misleading images. The media coverage within Gaza itself is extremely controlled. I mean, the Associated Press didn't realize, or so they say, that there were Hamas offices in the building they were in. This is really a flashback to 2014, where there was actually better on-the-ground coverage of what was happening in Gaza than there was this time around. I think Hamas has probably gotten smarter in controlling things even more tightly. There were scenes that perhaps inadvertently slipped through their censorship of rockets being fired from the parking lot of the main hospital in Gaza. There were a number of things that happened, and a lot of what came out about how Hamas hid behind civilians only came out when the reporters left the country. I think it was an Italian reporter famously left the country and then announced everything that was really going on and how nobody will really report what's done. So you have a lot of controlled coverage, misleading narratives, embellishment of damage, claiming that people who are, quote unquote children, a child could be a 17-year-old military Hamas member. But that is portrayed in the media as a child. Unfortunately, in every conflict where you have a group like Hamas hiding behind civilians, civilians are going to be injured and killed, but you never hear that side of the narrative. But very important, what I think is most on topic for this panel and why we requested that these really two highly qualified people come on and explain to you is that accusations about violation of international law become part of the media narrative and become essentially weaponized as part of the informational war on Israel. During the conflict, you couldn't turn on a TV in the United States without hearing somebody in their 40-second coverage of the conflict on mainstream media talk about disproportionality, that the mere fact that more Palestinians have died than Israelis somehow means it's a war crime. And you hear that all the time. You see that sort of language in letters that professors are signing. And they're used as if the law of armed conflict requires that both sides lose as many people in the conflict. So I thought it would be really important to bring these two individuals on today. And I'm going to not say a whole lot more because I want you to hear from them about what international law actually says about armed conflict and the extraordinary extent to which the IDF goes to comply with international law. I attended a seminar at Cornell several years ago. I think there were two by the group Our Soldiers Speak, which is now the Miriam Institute, which would bring experts. And I think, in fact, I'm sure Colonel Bar-On was one of those. And there was another gentleman who came, I think, 2 or 3 years before that and walked through the process that the IDF goes through. And I was absolutely floored. I was absolutely astounded at the extreme extent to which they went to try to avoid unnecessary civilian casualties. So I'm going to let them speak. And I think the next speaker is going to be Professor Eugene Konderovich, someone I've known for many, many years. And you've seen me post on our website multiple times a couple of his videos about the legal case for Israel. And I learned so much from those videos about the actual, not just history of the conflict, but also the actual international law. So with that, I will turn it over to our next speaker, Professor Eugene Konderovich.
Thank you so much, Bill. It's a real pleasure to be talking to you and your audience. Such an important topic, and it's amazing to have so many people tune in to learn more about it. Okay, so first of all, the conflict, the Gaza conflict recently, like almost everything else involving Israel, in popular discussions was cast almost exclusively in international law terms. This is important. I think it itself deserves to be noticed. There's lots of wars around the world, lots of wars in which Western forces participate, NATO forces, and they're often discussed in a variety of terms. Are they good? Are they bad? Are they helpful? Who's winning? But when Israel is involved, there is an inevitable recourse to the language of international law. This is the case whether it's something that is in fact highly regulated by international law, like the law of war, but it's also the case when Israel is engaged in fairly routine domestic matters, like amending its constitution to reflect its national character in the nation state law, something which many, many Western European countries have done. That is also attacked as being a violation of international law, or its policy regarding the distribution of COVID vaccines, which, as we recall, was attacked as a violation of the law of international law, or its policy regarding handling property disputes, which in its nation's capital, the Sheikh Jarrah matter. All of these are inevitably cast in international law terms. And before we actually turn to the international law, I think it's interesting just to reflect why these debates are so much cast in international law, because mostly people don't like to talk about international law unless they're international lawyers. And that may be, I think, part of the answer. I think there may be, I would just suggest two reasons why these issues inevitably turn on questions of international law. One is precisely what I just said. Unless you're an international lawyer, you are almost certainly unfamiliar with the fine points of the first additional protocol to the 1949 Geneva Conventions. Indeed, even if you are an international lawyer, unless you're an international lawyer specializing in international humanitarian law, you are likely to be unfamiliar with this. So making claims about Israel's conduct in the context of international law is a way of shielding them behind a veil of expert discourse, which makes it hard for people to evaluate independently. And this is one of the things I hope to do, is give you tools to evaluate it independently by, instead of making claims about what international law says, showing you the international legal materials directly, or from the inside, as we would say. But I think it's another reason to consider why Israel is so frequently cast as a serial violator of international law norms, from everything from its domestic conduct to its conduct of hostilities, because I think there's this idea, the international law to people, to the layman, represents the rules of the civilized community, the rules that the countries of the world have agreed on to be part of the community of nations. And I think the undercurrent is, if Israel violates the rules by which countries of the world have agreed to conduct themselves, then it has, in a sense, lost the privilege of being part of the community of nations. And so it's a fundamental attempt to delegitimize Israel as a country. And I think that's why international law is so often invoked. Okay. In this case, the international law question is fairly easy. This was a conflict. I'll describe it as an international armed conflict between a terror entity controlling Gaza, between a government controlling Gaza, Hamas, and Israel. And the way the conflict proceeded is well known to everyone. Hamas primarily shot rockets, fairly blindly at Israeli cities. We do know they were aiming at particular cities. And they also used drones to attempt to carry explosives, mortar fire, and things like this, but principally rockets. Israel, in response, relied almost exclusively on air power, conducting a variety of strikes, airstrikes against targets in Gaza, as well as at some points in direct fire by tanks and artillery. Okay, so one of the central claims is that Israel violated the law of war by, and the claim is usually not spelled out precisely, but what underpins things like the infamous New York Times cover, the dead children in the Gaza war, showing all the dead children, predominantly Palestinian. The claims can be described as such that Israel violated the law of war by killing civilians. That's a very strong claim. Israel killed civilians. That's a violation of the law of war. Or perhaps Israel violated the law of war by killing more civilians than it had civilians killed on its side, or by causing civilian death not in proportion to the civilian casualties that it itself suffered. That's another description. Or perhaps, as the New York Times seems to suggest, that it violated the laws of war merely by the fact that children died as a result of its actions, or that the casualties on the other side were greater than the casualties on the Israeli side. Okay, none of these claims has any basis in international law or the law of armed conflict. International law recognizes the way wars are conducted in practice, and there has never been a war that is conducted without the loss of civilian life. It's very regrettable, but it's almost impossible. It's particularly difficult when one side positions military objectives next to civilian ones. But given the imperfections of targeting, given the imperfections of intelligence, civilian casualties are a predictable consequence even of the most righteous war, and they're not forbidden. What international law does do, it has a central principle of what's called distinction. And the principle of distinction, a fundamental rule of international law, requires that each side do something which would seem counterintuitive, right? That it clearly distinguish its fighting forces from the civilian population. That's the point of uniforms, right? This is not obvious, right? The natural inclination would be to not distinguish your armed forces, so specifically not to make them a target to the other guy, to the other side. So international humanitarian law says, no, you must essentially put a shoot me sign on belligerents, on people who are conducting war, so as to protect civilians, so the civilians will not be confused in the process. So it is an obligation of a belligerent to clearly distinguish their fighting forces, their combatants, from non-combatants. On this count, I think it's quite clear that Israel does this. Israel has a regular uniformed military, and Hamas does not do this. As a consequence of this, Israel's job is going to be much harder. Nonetheless, whether Hamas distinguishes itself from the civilian population does not itself prevent Israel from attacking Hamas targets. And let me show you the relevant provisions of international law directly, rather than just describing them to you. This is something you should always ask for people to do when they're making international legal claims, because you can just wave. It's very easy to wave your hands broadly in the direction of international law, and international law says it's a claim that is not much more coherent than some experts say. But it's very important to know, where does international law say this? The treaty I am showing you is called the First Additional Protocol of the Geneva Conventions. It is not a treaty that all countries have signed, but it is these provisions about the protection of the civilian population are generally seen as encapsulating customary international law and are fairly uncontroversial. So what Article 51, protection of the civilian population, prohibits is indiscriminate attacks, right? So we mentioned there's the principle of distinction. One side needs to distinguish its combatants from its non-combatants, and the other side needs to also distinguish in its targeting between combatants and non-combatants. What is an indiscriminate attack? An indiscriminate attack is not an attack that kills civilians, and it is not an attack that foreseeably will kill civilians. It's an attack that is not aimed at a specific military objective. So you need to have a specific military objective. What are you not allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? Using a method or means of combat which cannot be directed at a specific military objective. So it's forbidden to use weapons or methods of combat which by definition will not be able to specifically target perfectly, even imperfectly, military objectives. What would be an example, perhaps, of a method of combat which cannot be directed at a specific military objective? Aiming a rocket or 100 rockets at the city of Tel Aviv and claiming, as Hamas sometimes would, there's some military targets in Tel Aviv. Maybe we're trying to hit them. Maybe we're trying to hit the defense ministry headquarters. But those rockets are incapable of being directed with such specificity. And so they're essentially directed just at the target of Tel Aviv. So let's see what's considered indiscriminate. An attack which may be expected to cause incidental loss of civilian life. Oh, wait, so it looks like it's true. It looks like it's true that the claim made that Israel violates the international law of war by causing an incidental loss of civilian life. As always in legal materials, you need to read to the end of a sentence. Never trust anyone. I always tell my students, never cite part of a statutory sentence. Never cite part of a provision. Cite the whole provision, and otherwise it looks like you're hiding something. So an indiscriminate attack is an attack that may be expected, that in advance, when these decisions are made, something Colonel Baron is going to talk about, to cause incidental loss of civilian life, which would be excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated. And that is the fundamental rule, that civilian casualties are permitted, they can even be anticipated. That is to say, a target is a lawful target if it is a military objective, and yet the targeter knows there will be civilian casualties. If the civilian casualties that are expected, which by the way is different from the ones that actually happen, are not excessive in relation to the concrete and direct military advantage anticipated, which means it is lawful to strike military objectives. We'll talk about what that is in a minute. Knowing that there may be civilian casualties, knowing that there are expected to be civilian casualties, but those civilian casualties must not be excessive in relation to what one hopes to gain. So what does that mean if one is attacking a very important military objective? Let's say a weapons production facility or targeting a very important military leader, then the advantage arising from targeting that would be greater, and so the civilian casualties would be greater. But for example, you cannot, let's say it would be questionable whether one could target a single soldier, knowing that 100 civilians will be killed in the process. If it's just an ordinary soldier, that might seem excessive. So the proportion, there is some requirement of proportionality in international law, but it's not proportionality between the casualties on your side and the casualties on the other side, let alone the civilian casualties on your side and the civilian casualties on the other side. There is absolutely no. Why are Israel's civilian? Let me put it this way: why are Israel's civilian casualties so low? Because it invests huge efforts to protect the civilian population with measures like Iron Dome and so forth. The notion that there needs to the attacks one can make on an opposing force need to remain in proportion with your own civilian casualties would mean that the better you are at protecting your civilian population, the less you can fight your enemy. And that is an extraordinary notion that has absolutely no basis in international law or international practice. And I'll give you some examples. It's pretty intuitive. Part of successfully fighting a war is inflicting more casualties on the other side than one suffers. It's not necessary to successfully fighting a war, but is a very common correlate of prevailing in a military conflict. There are very few examples. I would think one that comes to mind is probably the Soviet Union in World War II, which suffered extraordinary casualties, where the casualties on a prevailing side would be higher than on the defeated side. So certainly the International Law of War does not prohibit attempting to successfully prosecute a war or in any way penalize a party for taking measures to protect its civilian population, which is a categorical good, right? That is to say, purely protective measures like Iron Dome, we wish everybody had them, right? It doesn't matter if you're like on the right side of the war or the wrong side. There is no discouragement in international law from protecting one's civilian population. A doctrine of proportionality would, in fact, penalize parties that do so. So all of this determination of excessiveness is made in advance, right? In the fog of war, not afterwards, when it turns out that mistakes may have been made. Not afterwards when, for example, Hamas may tamper with the evidence, attempt to inflate the body count, or otherwise obscure the actual facts. The legality of the action is made at the time of the strike, not subsequently, based on the information available to the commanders at the time. Moving on. But let's say you have a mixed objective. You have a military objective that's surrounded by civilians. So the additional protocol specifically addresses the question, the use of human shields. The presence or movement of the civilian population shall not be used to render certain points or areas immune from military operation. In particular, attempts to shield military objectives from attacks or to shield, favor, or impede military operations. So what's that say? It says it is illegal. It is illegal to attempt to shield military objectives by placing them amongst civilians or bringing civilians to them. That is a clear violation of international law. And that, of course, applies to much of Hamas's conduct. So as we're going through this, we're seeing that not only is Israel not violating these provisions, but it's quite clear that reading the provisions, it is exactly Hamas that is violating them by locating or moving civilian population in an attempt to render areas immune from military operations. Note also, the optional protocol does not say that it does render those sites immune, right? It does not say that the presence of civilians renders sites immune. It says you shall not put them there to try to render the sites immune. So again, civilian casualties are legal and permissible and lamentable, but are not violations of the law of war when they're not excessive in relation to a concrete military advantage in a strike on a legitimate military objective. Article 52 explains to us what is a military objective. First of all, attacks must be limited to military objectives. You cannot strike civilian objectives. You have to strike military objectives. But that does not mean that you cannot strike military objectives knowing that there may be civilian casualties. Because what is a military objective? Objects which by their nature, location, or purpose can be an effective contribution to military action and whose destruction helps your side. What's that mean? That means a Hamas rocket launcher is a military objective, whether it's located in a school or whether it's not located in a school. A Hamas headquarters or a Hamas technical facility is a military objective, whether or not it is in an office building, and whether or not the other tenants of that office building happen to be the Associated Press. It is the nature of the objective itself, not its surroundings, that determine whether it's a military objective. And I think there's no serious contention that the strikes that Israel made were on things that are military objectives, in the sense of attacks on things which the destruction or neutralization of which would create a military advantage. I want to cement this point here. The subparagraph 3 here says that in the case of certain specifically protected facilities, like a house of worship or a school, the presumption is that it is not a military objective unless you know otherwise. What does that mean? That means that it is actually legal to have strikes on a house or even on a school when there is not a doubt that is being used to contribute to military action. So if you're striking a school, the threshold of knowledge may be high, but this clearly says that regardless of the location of the military objective, if it is in fact a military objective that is contributing to the other party's military advantage, its location does not immunize it from being targeted. Okay, what does all of this mean? First of all, there's absolutely no doctrine linking casualties on one side to casualties on the other. The only linkage is between the military advantage you obtain through striking a target and the civilian casualties. Now, how does one measure that proportionality? In fact, there is no answer. There was a very interesting study that was carried out by some professors at the University of Haifa, Professor Statman and Professor Sulitzman Kinan at the Hebrew University. It was an experimental study, and they did something very interesting. Because how do you determine whether something's excessive? So in international law, there is no actual rule, right? There is no rule, and it's a matter of, let's say, approximation and conscience. What these professors did is they got commanders from 11 NATO countries together and subjected them to various experimental scenarios. Like they war gamed certain situations where there's a civilian target combined with a military objective to see what kind of casualties, civilian casualties, they would consider to be excessive in relation to the military objectives. And they did this in a wide variety of scenarios, 11 different countries, and the results were very interesting. There was no convergence in the determinations of proportionality of these 11 NATO countries, including countries that regularly conduct military operations together, like in Afghanistan. These commanders were all over the place in their determinations of what is excessive. In other words, international law and international practice does not, in fact, provide any clear standard. The one interesting note was that the Israeli commanders were far, far, far on the one end of the spectrum in their determination, in their gut feelings or determinations about what's excessive. And they were at the far end of the civilian protective side, far less willing to accept civilian casualties to achieve given military military objectives. Let me just conclude by in Israel's case, the relevant military objectives were of the highest value, namely the prevention of rocket strikes on Israeli civilian facilities, which is certainly a significant military objective. But let me just give you an example. What you don't see in the New York Times. In Afghanistan, just in 2019, most recent year for which we have data, the United States and its allied forces are said to have killed, by Defense Department accounts, 717 civilians in Afghanistan. U.S. civilians dead in Afghanistan, U.S. civilians killed by Afghani forces in 2019, 0. Similarly, in 2017, the Defense Department says United States military killed 500 civilians in Afghanistan. U.S. civilians killed by Afghani forces in 2017, 0. In Iraq, during the Iraq War in 2003, during simply the active state, the first phase of active military operations, right until the mission accomplished sign in 2003, U.S. and allied forces killed 7,419 Iraqi civilians. How many U.S. civilians did Iraqis kill? Outside of military contractors, 0. In the 2011 air campaign against Libya, NATO forces killed approximately 60 Libyan civilians. NATO civilians killed by Libya, 0. But you didn't see the New York Times front page saying, children killed in the Afghan war, to show that America didn't lose enough children in the Afghan war, or that America didn't lose enough children in the Libya war. This is a notion that is invented solely in the case of Israel, where ironically it fits the least. Okay, that's it for me.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly helpful. And so now we'll go to, last but certainly not least, Colonel Bar-On.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I want to thank the Legal Insurrection Foundation for extending the invitation to me, and also the Miriam Institute, in which I'm currently a senior legal analyst, for facilitating the participation of myself in this event. I retired 2 years ago as a colonel from the Israel Defense Forces. My last 2 positions have been the Deputy Military Advocate General, and I was also the faculty of the Israel National Defense College. What I would like to do now is take everything that Professor Konderovich has referred to, which I fully agree with, and put things in context, and maybe try to concretize them by looking through the lens of the last Gaza campaign from last month, and see what were the challenges, the operational and legal challenges in fighting in the Gaza environment in that campaign and previous campaigns. All the materials you will see here are from last month, unless I say otherwise. So we might want to start just by putting some geographical sense to the issue, because I appreciate the fact that maybe not all the people in our audience know what we're talking about. So this is the Gaza Strip. It's a tiny swath of land of merely 140 square miles. It's on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea, on the southern border of the state of Israel. Israel has ruled the Gaza Strip for 38 years, from 1967 to 2005. In 2005, Israel has unilaterally disengaged from the Gaza Strip, dismantled all the military facilities in the Strip, and also 22 communities of Jewish communities of people who have lived there for more than 3 decades. It's important to note that please look at all the pink and red spots on the map. This will indicate the inhabited areas of the Gaza Strip. It's important to look at it now because these are the places in which the 99.99% of the fighting will always take place. You can see that there are many, many open spaces in Gaza Strip, rural areas, but the fighting will never take place over there because of the modus operandi of Hamas, who always embeds themselves in those areas. Now we refer to Hamas. Hamas is a very extreme Islamic terror group that has been ruling Gaza ever since 2007. They took control of the Gaza Strip in a military coup. And in the past 14 years, we've had 4 major military campaigns in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. The last one last month, and in between those campaigns we had many smaller campaigns, rounds of hostilities that lasted anything from a few minutes to a few days. The last operation lasted for 11 days. In last May it was dubbed as Operation Guardian of the Walls by Israel. And to put things in a historic context, maybe, when we talk about the main threat from Gaza, the traditional main threat has been the rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel. What we see in this chart is the numbers of rockets that has been launched from Gaza to Israel in the past 15 years. The numbers don't go back to 2001, but this is when those attacks started 20 years ago. We can see a peak here in 2014 in Operation Protective Edge, in which almost 4,000 rockets were launched towards Israel in 50 days of fighting. And these are the figures for the last operation in Gaza that, as we recall, lasted for 11 days, in which more than 4,000 rockets have been launched towards Israel. So it's in fifth of the time of the 2014 campaign, more rockets have been launched. We can see that the vast majority of them reached Israel, but also 680 rockets fell inside Gaza, causing the death of numerous Palestinians, and 6% of them landed in the sea. Now, what we see here is the summary of the Hamas rocket arsenal. It has evolved significantly throughout the years, and they have now everything from very short-range rockets for 5 miles distance or 5 miles range to the biggest rocket they have launched in the last operation that has the range of about 160 miles. We can see the coverage of these rockets. They can now cover pretty much the vast majority of the area of the state of Israel, with more than 7 million people out of 9 million people living under the threat of these rockets. What we see here is the actual places that were hit by those rockets during the operation only in central Israel. I'm showing you this because central Israel is the area in Israel with the most densely or the most concentrated population centers in Israel. So how exactly does this salvos of rockets look like? Just to give you an idea. What we see here is a salvo of rockets to central Israel, and we also see the interceptors, the intercepting missiles of the Iron Dome. I will address those in a few minutes. As someone who has been under several of these attacks, I can tell you that is horrifying. Now, one of the main challenges for a military that's fighting such attacks in the offensive regard, meaning how do you target the launchers of these attacks is the fact that they are always embedded in a very densely populated area. What we see here is a video by a Russian channel, the RT channel, and we will see in a few seconds how those rockets are being launched from inside Gaza city towards Israel. We can see here, you can see the salvos, all those rockets, and then again a few seconds later, another salvo. You can see how densely populated, inhabited this area is. Obviously, this is a huge military challenge if you want to target those launchers. And this is just a still frame picture to allow you to see how there's a rocket launcher right next to a private residential house. So you can appreciate how challenging this is for a fighting military force. Another challenge or threat from Gaza for many years now has been the tunnel threat. Hamas and the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another terror group operating in Gaza, have been building for years, pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into a project of a network of tunnels inside Gaza. Some of these networks were offensive in nature, namely they were crossing the border inside Israel and had their exit holes near Israeli communities on the Gaza border. Israel dismantled most of these tunnels in the 2014 Gaza campaign, and then by building a subterranean wall on the Gaza border. But hundreds of miles of these tunnels for defensive means were still in Gaza, and during the operation, Israel targeted hundreds or even thousands of exit holes of these tunnels in order to neutralize the threat of militants emerging from the underground in a next round of hostilities, if God forbid that happens. Other threats from Gaza were cyber threat. Hamas has been developing very sophisticated cyber capabilities, explosive drones threats. They've been launching a few of them in the last operation, and luckily they've been intercepted by Israel. And they also have various maritime capabilities as naval commandos and underwater explosive vessels. Now, when we look at Israel's defensive means to against those rocket attacks, there are basically two main defensive means. The first one will be to have shelters in structures in Israel. Every citizen in Israel who's building his house will not get a permit unless he has a concrete secured room, a shelter inside his house. In fact, I'm sitting now in my study, which is my shelter. This is a concrete, like the walls here are all made of concrete, and we spent a lot of hours in this room in all previous campaigns. What we see here are children in a kindergarten in one of the villages near Gaza, and they're inside the shelter during one of these attacks. But obviously, in the communities near Gaza, they only have 15 seconds to get into these shelters. This is a video that was taken in Sderot, a city right near the Gaza border. And we can see here a brother and his sister caught in one of these attacks. We can hear the announcements of, it says red color. Red color is the code for a missile attack. And we can see how they're stranded out of their home during the attack. The other measure that Israel has been heavily investing in order to protect its civilians is the Iron Dome missile defense system. This is quite frankly a miracle. It has been very effective in thwarting those missile attacks. It has effectiveness rates of between 85 to 90%. This is not a Photoshop. This is a real photo taken by the AFP press agency. What we see in the on the right is a salvo of rockets from Gaza. What we see on the left is a salvo of Iron Dome intercepting missiles heading to these rockets in order to intercept them. Now, obviously, this system is very effective, as I said, but it does not give you an immunity or a guarantee. And these are just a few examples of houses that were hit by those rockets and people who got killed. We have a 5-year-old kid that was killed in Sderot, and this is a foreign worker from India, and then old men in Ramat Gan, not very far from my parents' home. So we had hundreds of structures and houses that were hit by those rockets during the attacks. And obviously, diminishing or having 85 less rockets hitting their targets does not mean having 1% less of the terror of the people that are being targeted by those rockets. I can tell you that this is really a horrifying experience to be under one of these attacks. So Professor Konderovich addressed very thoroughly the main principles of the law of armed conflict that we have to apply in these scenarios, and I will only add a few words. So when we talk about the principle of distinction, and obviously any fighting force has to distinguish between combatants and civilians, one of the challenges the IDF has to contend with in such a scenario is the fact that the Hamas combatants will not wear any uniform during the fighting, especially not when there is a ground operation and soldiers on the ground have to distinguish who is their enemy and who are the civilians on the other side. Another challenge is the fact that they manipulate the fact that they are part of a terror organization and not considered as a whole as part of the armed forces of a state. Obviously, when we talk about state militaries, such as the ones of the US military or the Israeli military, every member of the armed forces is a combatant, is a lawful target. I was a military lawyer and I was a lawful target. Then I was a military professor at a military college. I was a lawful target. Whereas when you look at the laws of war, you sometimes may be confused when you talk about people who have civilian functions during daytime and then combat functions during night times, or have lapses in their military operations. And this is obviously something that gives them an unfair advantage comparing to law-abiding forces of countries. So this is a first example of the imbalance, the lack of reciprocity in the obedience to the laws of war. Another issue is the use of human shields by these terror groups, either voluntarily or involuntarily. I will show you one example in a few moments. But obviously, when Hamas places their military, their combatants and military objectives within the surroundings of their civilians, they are making them human shields, at least involuntarily. We also had many instances in which civilians were called to protect military objectives, and they came and flocked the rooftops, for instance, of some of these objectives in order to allow the IDF to see them on the rooftops and avoid from attacking those lawful targets. Another principle, and Eugene referred to that, is the distinction between military objectives and civilian objects. And we will see some examples in which this distinction is becoming very challenging in these scenarios. I will not talk more about the principle of proportionality. I think Professor Konderovich has made the point very well, but we will see some examples in order to realize how challenging it is to implement this principle in the context we're talking about. With that, let me just say a few words about the legal endeavor of these operations, because myself as a military lawyer, I spent years of my life in this endeavor as a deputy military advocate general. I was in charge of approximately 1,000 lawyers who were devoted to make sure that the IDF complies with the rule of law. So when we look at this cycle, we can talk about things that happened prior to any conflict. The Geneva Conventions are part of the IDF orders. Every IDF soldier is obligated to comply by these conventions. Every soldier has to go through mandatory training in international law, and as a commander progresses through the ranks, he will get more in-depth military training, legal training as to his obligations. Before every operation, the IDF will get legal advice concerning every aspect of the procedures of warfare, methods of warfare, all sorts of legality of weapons, operational planning and targeting, and I will show you an example of that. During the operation itself, we have an ongoing legal advice. We have lawyers deployed with the military commanders on the battlefield. We have what we call the operational law apparatus, a bank of lawyers, experts in international law in all niches of the laws of armed conflict, and we also have a 24/7 legal war room. And after the fighting ends, there's a whole process, a very lengthy and arduous process of examining and investigating all the exceptional incidents that happened during the operation and learning the lessons from the operation in order to get better in next operations. So with that, let's look at the way the IDF is responding operationally to all the challenges we talked about. First of all, you've got to have a very accurate intelligence in order to operate in such a densely populated environment. When we talked about the what has been known to be called the metro of Hamas, there was one specific strike in which 160 fighter jets of the IDF attacked simultaneously many exit holes, hundreds of exit holes of these tunnels. We can see here just a few examples of the locations of these exit holes. Now, we can see here the route of one small segment of one of these tunnels, and we can see now how they have a school right here, a playground, a fire station, a mosque, a hospital, all of them in the immediate vicinity of the tunnel. Obviously, when you want to target the exit holes of these tunnels, you have a huge challenge in not inflicting collateral damage to all these other civilian structures. Another method the IDF uses is the use of coordination maps of sensitive sites. Sensitive sites will be all the sites which will be literally sensitive: mosques, hospitals, kindergartens, schools, etc. Now, this specific photo is from the previous Gaza campaign in 2014, not from the last Gaza campaign. I couldn't get one. What we see here, all the colorful polygons are all the sensitive sites in one neighborhood, in one village in Gaza, Beit Hanun. Now, what we see in the red circles are the positions from where rockets were fired, and all the different X's that we see are all sorts of military objectives, bunkers and tunnels and weapons caches. And we can see the very clear modus operandi of Hamas of locating their military objectives or launching their attacks from the immediate vicinity or inside all those sensitive sites. We can see it very clear in many of these sensitive sites. We can see how they have been manipulated during the operation to launch all those targets or all those attacks or to locate all those military targets. Another principle of the laws of armed conflict is the principle of precautions. namely a fighting force needs to take all the feasible precautions in order to mitigate civilian harm. Obviously, it can be done only when it's feasible, as I said, but you have to take every measure you can and make sure that you minimize the civilian harm of your adversary. The IDF has a very robust system of effective advance warnings. As far as I know, the IDF is the only military on earth that uses direct text messages to people on the ground, uses phone calls, leaflets, uses the media to warn the residents, the civilians, to specific places where there are impending attacks. I want to show you a short video by of the Palestinian TV channel that talks about the advance warning that one specific building got on the second day of the fighting.
عندما علمت بأن هذا البرج سوف يستهدف في تلك المنطقة تم إخلاء المكان بالكامل، تم إخلاء المربع والشارع والمنشآت المدنية والسكنية في تلك المنطقة بشكل كامل، من أطفال ومن نساء. وشفنا يعني الحارس أو الناطور كما يقال عنه الذي يعمل في هذا البرج تم تحذيره باتصال هاتفي من المخابرات الإسرائيلية، وقال له بالحرف الواحد اخلئ البرج وقل لهم بأن هذا البرج مستهدف وسوف يستهدف في أي لحظة. بعد هذا الاتصال بحوالي ساعتين تم استهداف هذا البرج.
And this is the phone call. We can skip that. That's a phone call that the guard of the tower got. But we talked about human shields. I want to show you another example of how these warnings, these advanced warnings, are being manipulated by Hamas. So this is a recording of one of these phone calls. An IDF phone call to a Gazan to evacuate a building with a civilian and more specifically, kids that were located in this military target.
يا حبيبي انا بقدرش اطلع كل الناس هذول من انا بدي اقل شي ساعتين على ما كلهم يطلعوا. يا اخوي لو ما بتطلع انا بطوف. انت طخ اللي بدك اياه سويه اللي بتنزله وبتتلقاه. لا اخوي لازم الواحد لازم يعمل كل شيء مشان مقبول. عندك مسؤوليه على الابناء لازم يموتوا، كل الاطفال لازم يموتوا. لا سمح على بدك تكتشف عشان تبين بشاعتكم.
If the children need to die, they will die. Okay, another operational measure is a very strict operational pre-planning. The IDF will use a set of pre-planning tools before every attack, and I will show you an example in a minute. Before every attack, you have a team of experts, of engineers, of physicists, of lawyers, of aerodynamics experts that look into every aspect of the attack, and they consider what will be the best way to destroy the military objective while minimizing collateral damage to any other adjacent object. And they will look at the what kind of specific precision-guided munitions they should use, what will be the right angle of attack that will avoid fragmentation to blast adjacent buildings, what will be the best time of the day to attack in order to avoid people in the surrounding of the target. Now, I want to show you, and I think Professor Jacobson, you referred to this process. I want to show you a real, what we call a target card. That's obviously a top secret target card, but it's been made public after the 2014 Gaza conflict. Each and every planned targeting, planned attack in Gaza or elsewhere, you can ask me later about Lebanon or whatever you want, has to go through this process that may take sometimes months until it's finished. You can see here the intelligence that you have on the target. What we have here is an arms cache in the house of a senior military commander. It's not only an arms cache, but this house of him is also being used as an operational planning site for the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You have the location, who is present at the target, the military commander, his family, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives. And you have the description of the target, the weaponry located inside, also both Kalashnikov steel pipes to manufacture projectiles and Grad missiles. And you also have saying about the sensitive sites. So in this case, there are no sensitive sites within a 100 meter radius of the target, so approximately 110 yards away from the target. Now you have the operational directives. Okay, so the objectives obviously is to strike the military target by a fighter jet, to destroy it while avoiding harm to civilians. And these are the conditions. Okay, we will see in a minute that this is a conditional strike, and these are the conditions. The conditions is that we will have real-time visual surveillance to make sure that we know what are the changing circumstances on the ground. The attack will be taking place in nighttime to make sure that there are no civilians around the house, that everybody is in their houses. And they will get individualized, effective, advanced warning. Okay, what does it mean? It means that we only target the house itself and the weapons inside it, even though some of the people inside the house are lawful targets. Okay, the military commander and the other Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives are lawful targets. Okay, but since there are also civilians, his family, the house will not be attacked before an individualized, effective, advanced warning, plus another precaution, which is called roof knocking. So what is roof knocking? In some cases, those phone calls end up with people negotiating with the IDF officer. They're telling him, do not attack us. This is not a military objective, or we will not leave the house. Okay, we will not leave this building. In these cases, the IDF will deploy a low munition projectile to the corner of the roof. This will not damage the house. It will only shake the house very strongly, make a very strong sound, and it has been very persuasive in convincing people to evacuate the house and save their lives. This is also obviously very pricey, very costly measure, but the IDF has been using it for thousands of times. And again, I'm not familiar with any military on earth that uses this technique in order to save civilian lives. And again, you see the legal review with all the conditions, and you can see the bottom line. This is a military objective, and these are the conditions for carrying out the attack. Now, what happens if things or circumstances change on the ground? In many cases, the attack will be canceled. You can see an example from the last operation from last month. Okay, you can see that they identifying some figures that they suspect might be children, and they just canceled the attack. So with that, I would like to conclude. I want to thank my co-panelists and again the foundation, the Legal Insurrection Foundation, for me it's very important to emphasize that even though we hear a lot about these challenges in the Israeli context, these are the same challenges. I've had the privilege to interact with hundreds of military lawyers from around the world, from many other democracies, obviously mainly from the US and UK and Australian and Canadian, but many other democracies. And these are the same challenges. We've seen these challenges in Afghanistan and in Kosovo and in Iraq and in fighting in Libya and with the Islamic State. So it's very important that all like-minded states will cooperate in having a dialogue about these challenges and finding ways to tackle these challenges, because obviously people tend to identify themselves with the weak side, in this case Hamas, thinking that the weak side would normally be the right side or the side with the upper moral hand. But in many cases, and this is a good example, the weak side is the evil side, and it shouldn't confuse people in democracies to be siding with evil, with terrorist groups. I think it's very important to relay that message. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was another fantastic presentation, and I know I learned a lot. It was a great refresher in some ways, and I learned an awful lot. So I'm going to go through some of the questions that we have, and for those who are still with us, if you do have questions, please go ahead and put those in the Q&A section. We'll get through as many as we can. I think this is a great question to start with for those who are not learned in international law or who have not studied it. What is the origin of international law, and who decided what international law is, and how did that come to be? If anyone has just a brief answer to that, I think that would be very helpful for those watching.
Let me take a stab at that.
Yeah.
So international law comes from authority, right? A binding authority. International law, the question is, what is the authority that is above countries? So it used to be that international law was a branch of natural law, and the supreme authority was seen as God. But now, in a more positivist time, God's out of the picture, so there's nothing above countries. Countries are the supreme authorities, which means that international law has to come, rules that restrict the freedom of countries have to come from the countries themselves. And that can happen in two primary ways. One is what's called custom, which is if countries engage in a practice repeatedly with a sense of legal obligation, not just because it's convenient or for any other reason, that a customary norm could develop. You could have unwritten rules, which are very similar to unwritten contracts. For example, you go to the newspaper kiosk, if they still have those, take a newspaper, it means you've agreed to give the person $1, right? It's an unwritten contract. But most of international law these days, but it's very hard for countries to converge without words being used on such uniform practices. So it's very hard for custom to form. But what treaties are another form. So treaties are contracts. Countries can make deals with accept rules that bind them. And all of the material I showed you are treaties, but which also are thought to reflect custom. The rules I have discussed are fairly uncontroversial and are generally accepted by the countries of the world. Now, by the way, there's a difference between the rule and its application. So as I mentioned, everyone agrees that you cannot have civilian casualties excessive in relation to anticipated military advantage, but nobody agrees what excessive means. So for that part of the definition has not been supplied by international law. It's not supplied by custom, and that means it's undetermined.
Great, thank you. That was helpful as well. So we do have another question, and this one says, what is the significance of the distinction or division between Hamas and Islamic Jihad?
Okay, I can address that very very shortly. I'll just say the Hamas, both of them are very extreme Islamic groups. The main difference is that Hamas, at least for the last 1.5 decades, had to rule Gaza, and with that they became semi-state. Okay, they have to run a government, they have Ministry of Education, Ministry of Interior, etc., etc. So they are part of the Palestinian political game. Okay, they were running for Palestinian parliament in the last elections 15 years ago in 2006, whereas Palestinian Islamic Jihad will not take part in the political game, will not run their representatives to parliament. They are even more extreme than Hamas when it comes to dealing with Israel. And they are in many ways much more affiliated with Iran than Hamas. They are heavily dependent on Iran for their funds, for their weapons, etc. So these are the main differences.
That's actually a great lead into another question that we have. Someone asked or suggested please comment on the report some years ago of the Iranians shipping 150,000 rockets into the area. And I think the broader question here would be the role of Iran in the area and how that's being dealt with.
Okay, so I can also address that. The Iranians have been very active in surrounding Israel with all sorts, like operating through all sorts of proxies in the area. So they have Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is their biggest and strongest proxy. They have militias in Syria with all sorts of Shiite combatants coming from Afghanistan and Pakistan and many other places. They have the Houthis in Yemen, and they also have the support they give to Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza and the West Bank. So they've been spending billions over the years on all these proxies. And in fact, when you follow the protests in Iran, whenever you have a cycle of protests every few years, you will many times hear the protesters say, stop spending all this money on other countries, on conflicts where we have no relation to, and spend it on us. There are too many poor people here in Iran for us to be spending all this money abroad.
Okay, so the next question, I think, is a great question too. And it says, it may seem simplistic, but once a group is considered to be a terror organization internationally, do we legally have to apply the law of armed conflict to fighting with them, or is it simply a moral imperative?
Mm-hmm.
There is no international listing of terror groups. When we say something is a designated terror group, usually we're referring in the West. It depends where you are. The United States State Department has a list of what's called designated foreign terrorist organizations. Also a separate list of terror supporting countries. There is a definition of terrorism, but there is no central. Well, international law lacks centralized decision-making or compulsory adjudication system. And so every country decides for itself who is a terrorist. America has a list. The UK has a list. Germany has a list. Israel has a list. The United States list is very influential. The designation of a group as a terrorist organization does not in any way change any aspect of the law of war. Terror is the targeting of civilians for political ends. But to the extent that they would choose to also put on uniforms and conduct regular military operations, they would have all of the privileges and disabilities of combatants. In other words, you could be a terrorist and a combatant at the same time. Right? Terror is the illegal targeting of civilians for certain political ends, but that does not mean you cannot also be at the same time engaged in regular military operations.
Thank you.
I actually have a question for both of you. What can Israel do better to fight this media/international law war? And a prime example is our media was completely obsessed with the taking down of the building that the AP office is, and I think Al Jazeera was in the building also. And yesterday, the IDF finally issued a report on it. Okay, how many weeks later? What is the process at the IDF? My recollection is that in 2014, they were much more efficient at getting information out. Why wasn't this what is the process internally, and why does Israel always seem to be a week behind? I mean, the lies have traveled 10 times around the world before Israel gets the truth out. And I'm just curious, how can that be changed?
Well, I'll start. Well, obviously, there's a huge challenge in satisfying the appetite of the media for information and data regarding such an operation. Most of the information that the military uses in such operations will be classified intelligence. Now, you will not be able to reveal the information, the intelligence, because either you expose a human source operating with your forces inside Gaza, and then he will just end up dying, or you expose the methods that you use in order to collate this information. So exposing such information may be, you've seen how I shared the target card, okay? And you've seen how different parts, I'll share it again, just you can see it. You can see how even after a very long process of people trying to make this public, still they had to put some information out of the eyes of the public, okay? Because obviously the exposure will make it will be a security risk for the IDF. So the problem is clear. I can agree that maybe there could be a better effort to maybe prepare the let's say the media front of this campaign better, but the challenges will always be there, and it's always more compelling to see pictures of buildings falling to the ground, being destroyed. They look like private civilian buildings, and people will always assume it's just civilian buildings that have been attacked. And explaining the whole process of what was in this building and how we got to know that this was a military objective, etc. That it will always be arduous, and you can never defeat those pictures.
Thank you. And we have one more question, and then we're going to wrap up. And I think this is a great way to conclude. How are infringements of laws of conflict settled and enforced?
Eugene, you want to take this one?
Say it one more time.
How are infringements of laws of conflict settled and enforced?
Yeah. Okay, good. So this goes with what I was saying before. So international law, we talked about where it comes from. It is not a top-down system, and it's not a centralized system. There is no court of general international jurisdiction for law of war crimes. Typically, infringements of the law of war are enforced by the countries involved themselves. So, for example, Western democracies like Israel, the United States, will investigate and, as needed, prosecute their own countrymen, their own servicemen, for violations of the law of war in their own military courts, and indeed, the military law department that Colonel Baron was on. That's part of what they do. That's one of the things military advocate generals do, is prosecute soldiers for violating laws of war. In some cases, countries have also prosecuted their defeated enemies. That was the Nuremberg case. But you have to really win a complete capitulation to have that kind of control over the enemy. There was an attempt to prosecute German officials after World War I, which was not successful. So basically, it is decentralized. It's up to each country, and we are 100% sure that Hamas is not going to prosecute its own, because it's not, for them, it's not a bug, it's a feature. Now, there is the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is a court that only has jurisdiction over countries that accept it as jurisdiction. Israel has not, for a variety of legitimate reasons. Nonetheless, the court has decided that it nonetheless has jurisdiction based on its determination that Palestine is a state. So theoretically, they could investigate. But it would be based on already an illegitimate assertion of jurisdiction at the bequest of a member that is not, in fact, a state, over a state that is not a member. At the same time, again, the ICC, they don't have police, they don't have marshals. They don't have an FBI. They have no system for the compulsory collection of evidence, right? They don't have a they don't have a really enforceable subpoena power. So their ability to collect evidence is left basically to the mercy of the parties. And I'm sure at some point Hamas will let them visit and take a highly choreographed tour of some rubble site a year from now. But that is not a real examination of evidence.
Thank you so much. And I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up with that. I want to thank everyone for attending today. I also
May I add just one thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm just reading one of the messages on the chat. Constraining soldiers through authority of lawyers is unethical in and of itself during a war. If you're someone were on a battlefield, how would you feel if lawyers had authority over him? It's ridiculous. Well, I feel compelled to clarify. Soldiers on the battlefield don't need to call their lawyers to get a permission to defend themselves or fight. This is not what I was saying. It's not like they don't have a speed dial to a lawyer. Can I retaliate against the fire that I'm being under now? This is not what we have. We have lawyers working with the commanders and going through, as I showed you, going through the process of approving targets, going through the process of thinking about all aspects of procedures of war and legality of weapons, etc. It's very important to have the lawyers in all these processes. But our soldiers know how to fight while following the law. This is what I talked about. I talked about the obligatory legal training that commanders have to go through. This is in order to allow them to know their obligations without calling the lawyers on the battlefield. And it's very important to know that.
Thank you. I think that's an incredibly important clarification. So thank you for doing that. So yeah, I think that wraps it up for today. I want to, of course, thank our fantastic panel today. This was incredibly informative and helpful for everyone who has registered. Usually takes us about a week. We will email you the video. We'll also post it to the Legal Insurrection blog. But I want to thank you for taking time to join us today. And I want to thank our presenters once again for sharing their knowledge with all of us. It's tremendously helpful, especially in these times with these headlines. And it's my hope, and I do believe too, that this will enable us to better discern what we're being told and whether or not it seems to mesh with reality and fact and what's really happening in this conflict. So again, thank you to everyone. And it is always my message, kind of my goal in all of these things, to remind you that you are not alone. The media is skewed. We all know that. We know that just the same as we know that water is wet. The stories that are being told about the conflict are in the same way skewed, but you're not alone in this. There's so many people out there, though our megaphones are not as loud as those who are skewing stories, who know what's happening and who are working diligently to tell the truth and to make sure that the public is as informed as we can possibly be, so that they can discern accordingly. So just know that you're not alone, whether it's in this or any other issue, and we are here. And if you have questions, if you need guidance or pointers on where to turn to get involved and how to help share truth, like share a video of this particular panel, just reach out to us and let us know. We're always around. So again, thanks to everyone. We appreciate you, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.